If I hadn't moved you, you'd be dead. Sonny's voice was low beneath the hard rush of wind, but Caleb Foster heard every word from where he lay in the dirt. His lantern had fallen 6 feet away, its flame trembling behind dusty glass, throwing restless light across the barn wall. A heartbeat earlier, Caleb had been standing there. Then Sonny had struck him from the side and driven them both to the ground, just as a blade swept through the darkness where his throat had been. Now the attacker was running. Boots hammered across the frozen yard. A horse snorted beyond the northern fence, followed by the violent creak of saddle leather and hoofbeats disappearing into the night. Caleb pushed himself onto one elbow. Sonny was already standing. Her long black hair had come loose in the struggle, and wind pulled it across her warm brown face. In one hand, she held the knife she had torn from the attacker. Her breathing was quick, but her dark eyes were steady. Caleb looked at the slash across the shoulder of his coat. Another inch closer, and the blade would have found flesh. "You hurt?" he asked. Sonny glanced at him as though the question surprised her. "No," she offered him her free hand. Caleb took it. Only that afternoon, Marshal Everett Cole had stood on this same ranch and warned him not to trust her. Mason Vale had been less polite. "Keep that Apache woman off your land," he had said. Caleb had ignored them both. Now the woman they feared had just saved his life. He retrieved the lantern and raised it toward the barn. Sonny crouched near the doorway. Something lay half-hidden beneath the straw, a small leather pouch that had not been there before. Caleb reached toward it. "Don't." Sonny studied the boot marks beside it, then looked toward the darkness where the rider had vanished. "He wasn't here for me." Caleb felt the cold differently then. Sonny lifted her eyes to his. "He came for you." Caleb kept the lantern low while Sonny studied the tracks pressed into the dirt beside the barn. She did not touch the leather pouch. Instead, she followed the boot marks to the northern fence, where the earth had been torn by a horse leaving hard and fast. Caleb stayed several steps. Behind her, "You recognized something?" he asked. Sonny crouched and brushed loose soil from a hoofprint. "Maybe." Wind moved through the cottonwoods with a dry whisper. She looked toward the black hills beyond the ranch. But guessing is not knowing. Caleb remembered Marshal Cole's warning from that afternoon, and Mason Vale's colder one. "Keep that Apache woman off your land." Neither man had offered proof. Sonny rose and returned to the barn. Caleb watched her place the stolen knife beside the untouched pouch, preserving both exactly as they had been left. "Cole should see this before anyone moves it," she said. Caleb nodded. Only then did he notice a thin line of blood across Sonny's palm. "You said you weren't hurt." "I said I was not hurt badly." He brought clean cloth from the house and held it toward her rather than taking her hand. Sonny looked at the cloth, then at him, before accepting it. "Why did you believe me today?" she asked quietly. Caleb's gaze settled on the darkness outside. "I didn't." Her eyes hardened slightly. Then he added, "I believed you deserved to be heard." Sonny wrapped her palm in silence, and something in her expression softened, not into trust yet, but into the possibility of it. Long before Sonny's blood marked the cloth in Caleb's hand, Caleb Foster had learned what happened when a man borrowed certainty from a crowd. 3 years earlier, his closest friend, Thomas Reed, had been accused of moving stolen cattle through the northern range. The evidence had been thin, a familiar brand found where it should not have been, tracks crossing Reed's grazing land, 2 men swearing they had seen riders near his place after midnight. Caleb had known Thomas for 11 years. They had ridden through winter storms together, buried calves after a hard spring, and once spent 2 days searching the foothills for Caleb's missing father. None of that had mattered when Silver Creek began whispering. Caleb had not accused Thomas himself. Somehow that made the memory worse. He had simply failed to stand beside him. Thomas left before the truth surfaced 6 weeks later, when another ranch hand admitted the cattle had been moved across Reed's property. Deliberately, Caleb never saw his friend again. Since then, Foster Ranch had become a quiet place. Caleb worked before sunrise, ate alone more evenings than not, and kept his cattle spread across several hundred acres of dry New Mexico grassland, where juniper climbed the distant slopes and wind could travel for miles without meeting a wall. He was 39 now, broad-shouldered and sun-browned from years outdoors, with pale skin beneath the line of his collar and the habit of watching longer than most men found comfortable. That morning had begun like any other. Frost silvered the water trough. His ranch dog, Tucker, slept beneath the porch until Caleb crossed the yard, then followed him toward the barn. Caleb checked the horses first. Always the horses. By 8, the sun had burned the frost away. By 10, he found 2 sections of fence cut along his southern pasture. Not broken. Cut. The wire ends were clean and bent outward. Tucker sniffed the ground, then wandered towards several hoofprints crossing the dirt. Caleb crouched beside them. Too many for his herd. Cattle had passed through recently, perhaps during the night. He followed the trail nearly a mile before it disappeared onto hard ground. At noon, 3 riders appeared on the eastern road. Marshal Everett Cole rode in front, with Mason Vale beside him. Caleb knew Mason well enough to dislike the ease of his smile. The third rider was one of Vale's hands. "Lose any cattle?" Cole asked after dismounting. "Not that I've counted." Caleb wiped his hands on his trousers. Mason glanced toward the southern pasture. "Someone else has." 27 head from my west range." Caleb said nothing. Tracks went toward Apache country. Mason continued, then turned north. Cole watched Caleb carefully. "We're checking every ranch along the route." Caleb's eyes shifted toward Mason. "Checking or deciding?" Mason smiled. "Depends what we find." Before Caleb could answer, Tucker rose beneath the porch and stared south. A lone rider had appeared beyond the fence. The woman approached without haste on a dark bay mare. Her long black hair was braided down her back, and the afternoon sun warmed the deep brown of her skin. "Hey!" Knife rested at her belt, but her hands remained visible on the reins. Mason's expression changed before she reached the yard. "That's her." Caleb looked at him. "You know her?" "Seen her near the southern range." The woman stopped several yards from them. Her mare was breathing harder than the distance should have required, and Caleb noticed she favored one front hoof. The woman's gaze moved from Cole to Mason, then settled on Caleb. "This is Foster Ranch." "It is." "Then someone moved stolen cattle across your land last night." Mason gave a short laugh. "Convenient story." Her eyes turned toward him. For the first time, something sharpened in her expression. Caleb saw it and remembered Thomas Reed standing outside the Silver Creek mercantile while men decided what his silence meant. Mason leaned toward Caleb. "Don't trust her." Caleb looked at the woman again. Dust covered the lower half of her clothes. Her horse was tired. She had ridden far to bring information that could easily place suspicion on herself. Caleb stepped away from Mason. "What's your name?" "Sonny." "All right, Sonny." He nodded toward the cut fence beyond the pasture. "Show me what you saw." Mason stopped smiling, and Sonny looked at Caleb for a long moment before turning her horse south. Caleb could not know that before the next sunrise she would save his life. But as he followed her toward the open range, he knew one thing with certainty. This time, he would look at the evidence before he listened to the crowd. Sonny led Caleb south without looking back to see whether he followed. Marshal Cole and Mason Vale remained near the ranch house, their voices fading behind them as the horses crossed the cut fence and entered open country. The afternoon sun lay low over the New Mexico range, turning the grass pale gold and throwing long shadows beneath scattered juniper. After half a mile, Sonny slowed her mare. Caleb noticed the animal favor the same front hoof again. "Your horse needs rest." Sonny glanced at him. "She needs me to finish first." She dismounted beside a dry wash where the earth remained soft beneath a shelf of stone. Caleb followed. At first he saw nothing but broken grass and overlapping hoofprints. Sonny crouched and pointed. "Cattle came through here." "Vales?" "Maybe." Caleb almost smiled. "You don't guess much." Guessing becomes truth too easily when enough people repeat it. The words struck closer than she could know. Sonny moved along the wash. Reading marks Caleb would have ridden past without noticing. She showed him where cattle had been pushed too tightly together, where one animal had stumbled, where mounted riders had circled behind the herd. Then she stopped beside a blackened fragment half buried in dust. Caleb picked it up carefully. "Burned hide. Brand. Someone changed one." She traced the edge without touching it. Old mark burned over with another. Caleb looked north toward his ranch. "Why bring them across my land?" Sonny rose. "That is what I came to tell you." She walked another 100 yards until the trail crossed harder ground. There she found a horseshoe impression pressed beside a patch of damp clay. One side of the shoe carried an unusual squared edge. Sonny stared at it longer than the others. "You recognize that?" Her face gave him little. "I have seen it." "Where?" She looked toward the distant hills. 2 days ago, on a gray gelding near Vale's western range. Caleb's jaw tightened, but Sonny immediately added, "That does not prove Mason Vale rode here." Caleb nodded. "It proves a horse wearing that shoe did." Her eyes met his. For the first time since arriving, she seemed almost surprised by him. Wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dry sage. Sonny turned back toward her mare. The animal took 3 short steps and stumbled. This time Caleb said nothing. Sonny knelt and lifted the hoof. A small stone had worked deep beside the frog, leaving the surrounding tissue tender. She removed it carefully, but when the mare lowered her foot again, she still favored it. "She shouldn't carry you farther today," Caleb said. Sonny stroked the mare's neck. "There is a creek 2 miles south. My barn is half a mile north." Her shoulders stiffened. Caleb noticed. "There's an empty stall," he said. "You can leave whenever you want." Sonny studied him before leading the mare north on foot. Caleb dismounted and walked his own horse beside her rather than riding while she walked. Neither spoke. When they returned, Mason was still there. He watched Sonny approach beside Caleb and gave a humorless laugh. "You're bringing her onto the ranch now." Caleb tied his gelding to the rail. "Her horse is sore. Cole can take her into town." Marshal Cole stepped from the porch. "Would make things simpler." "For who?" Caleb asked. Cole's expression hardened. 27 cattle are missing. "And what evidence says she took them?" Silence answered. Mason leaned against the hitching rail. "You really want to risk your stock for someone you met an hour ago?" Caleb looked at Sonny. She was examining her mare's hoof again, apparently indifferent to the argument, but he saw how carefully she listened. "I'm not risking anything by letting a tired horse rest." Mason stepped closer. "If something disappears tonight, don't say nobody warned you." Caleb's gaze settled on him. "If something disappears tonight, then I'll have something to judge." Mason's face tightened. He mounted without another word. As he turned his gray gelding toward the road, Sonny's attention dropped sharply to the horse's hind shoe. Caleb saw her see it. The squared edge was unmistakable. Neither of them spoke until Mason disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. Then Sonny looked at Caleb. "That is the horse." Caleb stared after the empty road, feeling suspicion rise inside him. He forced it back down. Suspicion was not proof. "We'll remember it," he said. Sonny held his gaze for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. Caleb opened the barn door for her mare. Sonny led the animal inside herself. Outside, the sun slipped behind the hills, and the first long shadows of evening stretched across Foster Ranch. Somewhere beyond those shadows, a gray horse was carrying Mason Vale home, and Caleb could not shake the feeling that before morning, someone would return. The barn settled into evening around them. Sonny worked beside her mare beneath the yellow glow of a hanging lantern, cleaning the tender hoof with slow, practiced movements. Caleb brought warm water, clean cloth, and a small tin of salve, placing each within reach without telling her how to use any of it. She noticed. "You always let strangers take over your barn?" she asked. Caleb leaned against the stall door. "Only the dangerous ones." Sonny looked up sharply. The faintest trace of amusement crossed his face. She returned to the hoof. "Then your judgment is poor." "Been told that before." Outside, Marshal Cole's horse shifted near the porch. He had stayed after Mason left, unwilling to abandon the matter entirely. When he entered the barn, his gaze moved from Sonny to Caleb. "I can take her into Silver Creek until we sort this out." Sonny straightened. Caleb did not. "For what?" "Questioning." "You questioned her here." Cole lowered his voice. "Caleb, cattle disappear. An Apache woman shows up following the trail, and now you're giving her shelter. Her horse is lame." "That isn't the point." "It is to the horse." Cole exhaled through his nose. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Caleb looked at him then. "No evidence says she stole anything. No evidence says she didn't." The words hung between them. Caleb's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "That isn't how guilt works, Everett." Cole held his gaze, then glanced toward Sonny. "One night. Tomorrow morning, I want answers." "So do I." After the marshal rode away, darkness closed around Foster Ranch. Wind moved through the cottonwoods, rubbing bare branches together with a dry wooden whisper. Caleb prepared beans and salt pork inside the house. When Sonny appeared at the doorway, she had left her knife on a small table outside. Caleb noticed, but said nothing. He set another plate across from his own. She remained standing. "You do not lock your door?" "Not usually." You should. Maybe. She sat. For several minutes they ate without speaking. The silence was not comfortable yet, but neither tried to break it simply because it existed. Finally Sonny said, Mason knows I recognized his horse. Caleb nodded. I saw his face. You still do not believe he moved the cattle. I believe his horse was somewhere it shouldn't have been. Sonny studied him. You separate everything. Caleb looked down at his plate. I learned to. He did not explain Thomas Reed. Not yet. After supper, Sonny carried her plate to the basin despite Caleb telling her she could leave it. When she returned to the barn, Tucker followed. The ranch dog stopped halfway across the yard. His ears lifted. Sonny stopped too. Caleb, carrying the lantern behind her, nearly walked into her shoulder. What? She raised one hand. Tucker was staring toward the northern barn wall. No growl. No bark. Only stillness. Sonny listened. Wind. Cottonwood branches. A loose hinge tapping softly. Then nothing. Caleb stepped beside her. Coyote. Sonny shook her head. He would smell it. Tucker took 3 cautious steps forward and stopped again. Sonny's eyes moved across the darkness beyond the barn. Something has been near here. Caleb lowered the lantern instinctively, reducing the light around them. Recently. Maybe. She crouched near Tucker, touched 2 fingers to the dirt, then stood. The ground was too dry to hold a clear track. Could be nothing, she said. Caleb looked at her. You don't say that often. Because nothing is sometimes what people see when they stop looking. For the first time that evening, Caleb smiled without hiding it. Sonny noticed, and something in her guarded expression eased. They checked the horses together. Her mare had settled, the injured hoof resting comfortably in the straw. Caleb showed Sonny an empty room beside the tack area where she could sleep. He placed 2 blankets on a wooden chest and turned toward the door. Caleb. He stopped. Sonny looked toward the unlocked latch, then at him. You heard what they said about me. I did. And you still leave this open. Caleb rested one hand against the doorframe. A locked door wouldn't make me trust you. Their eyes held in the lantern light. Neither moved closer. Neither needed to. Caleb finally stepped outside and crossed toward the house. Sonny watched until his light disappeared behind the kitchen window. Then Tucker, still lying in the yard, suddenly raised his head toward the northern barn. Somewhere beyond the reach of the lanterns came the faint, unmistakable creak of saddle leather. Sonny did not move when the sound came again. Leather underweight. Faint, controlled, close enough that whoever sat in the saddle was trying not to be heard. Tucker rose without barking, his body rigid beneath the cold moonlight. Sonny reached for the knife she had left outside the house, then stopped. Taking it would mean crossing the open yard. Instead, she slipped behind the barn wall and listened. The wind had strengthened, carrying dust through the cottonwoods and making the branches scrape together overhead. Another sound came from beyond the northern fence, a horse breathing through its nose. Sonny moved along the shadowed side of the barn, placing each step carefully. Through a narrow gap between the boards, she saw a figure dismount near the fence and lead a horse toward the rear of the building. The rider wore a dark coat and kept his hat low. She could not see his face. She could see the horse. Not gray. Whoever had come tonight had been careful enough to change mounts. The stranger tied the animal beyond the cottonwoods, then approached the barn carrying something beneath his coat. Sonny waited. He entered through the side door Caleb rarely used. A minute passed, then another. When the man emerged, his hands were empty. Sonny watched him move toward the corner nearest the main yard and flattened himself against the wall. He was waiting for someone. Her gaze shifted toward the ranch house. A lamp still burned behind Caleb's kitchen window. Sonny understood. She stepped backward, intending to reach the house without revealing herself. But Tucker suddenly trotted from the darkness toward the barn. The stranger heard him. His head turned. Tucker gave one sharp bark. Light appeared inside the house. Sonny's stomach tightened. No, she whispered. Caleb opened the back door carrying a lantern. Tucker. The dog looked toward him, then toward the barn. Caleb crossed the yard. Sonny moved fast, staying inside the shadows, but Caleb was already approaching the corner. The stranger's hand disappeared beneath his coat. Moonlight caught steel. Caleb. He turned toward her voice. That movement saved only half a second. Sonny struck him from the side with her shoulder. They hit the dirt together as the knife swept through the space where Caleb's throat had been. The lantern flew from his hand and rolled across the yard without going out. The attacker stumbled after the missed strike. Sonny came up first. He swung again. She caught his wrist with both hands, turned beneath his arm, and forced it against the barn wall. The knife dropped. The man drove an elbow backward, catching her across the shoulder. Pain flashed down her arm, but she held long enough to kick the blade away. Caleb regained his feet and moved toward them. Stop! The attacker tore free before Caleb could reach him. He ran for the northern fence. Caleb started after him, but Sonny caught his sleeve. No, he's getting away. That may be what he wants. Caleb looked toward the darkness beyond the cottonwoods. A man running into unfamiliar night could lead a pursuer anywhere. He stopped. Seconds later came the creak of a saddle, then hard hoofbeats fading north. Only when the sound disappeared did Caleb look down at the slash across his coat. His face went still. Sonny bent, retrieved the knife, and checked the yard. If I hadn't moved you, you'd be dead. Caleb looked at her. You knew he was there. I heard him. Why didn't you wake me? I wanted to know what he came for. She walked to the barn entrance. The side door stood slightly open. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed until Sonny noticed fresh straw scattered near an empty stall. Beneath it lay a small leather pouch. Caleb started toward it. Don't. He stopped immediately. Sonny crouched without touching the pouch. A piece of stamped metal showed through the opening. Caleb recognized the shape. Cattle tag. Sonny's expression hardened. He put it here. Caleb stared at the pouch, then at the path the attacker had taken. The plan settled into place with an ugliness that made the cold seem sharper. Missing cattle. Evidence hidden in his barn. A dead rancher unable to explain how it arrived. By morning, suspicion would become certainty before anyone bothered asking questions. He wasn't here for me, Sonny said. Caleb's eyes lifted to hers. He came for you. For several seconds neither spoke. The wind pressed against the barn and sent the lantern flame trembling. Caleb finally noticed blood on Sonny's palm where the knife guard had cut her during the struggle. You're bleeding. It is small. Still blood. Inside the house, he found clean cloth. When he returned, Sonny stood exactly where he had left her, guarding the untouched pouch. Caleb held the cloth out, instead of reaching for her hand. She accepted it slowly. Their fingers brushed for no more than a heartbeat, but Sonny's eyes rose to his. There was no gratitude in Caleb's expression now, nothing large enough to embarrass either of them. Only the quiet recognition that one life had depended upon another. Sonny wrapped her palm. Caleb looked toward the barn, and then toward the dark northern road. Cole sees everything exactly as we found it. Yes. And tomorrow we follow whatever trail is left. Sonny studied him. You believe me now? Caleb considered the question. I believe someone tried to kill me. A faint disappointment entered her eyes before he continued. And I believe you chose to stop him when you could have ridden away. The disappointment vanished. Beyond them, Tucker finally lay down again. Sonny lowered her gaze to the white cloth around her hand, then quietly said, That is enough for tonight. Caleb looked at her beneath the wavering lantern light and realized trust had not arrived between them like lightning. It had come quietly, one choice at a time, and tonight, one of those choices had kept him alive. Morning came slowly to Foster Ranch, first as a pale line behind the eastern hills, then as cold blue lights spreading over the corrals. Caleb had slept less than an hour. Sonny, he suspected, had not slept at all. When Marshal Everett Cole rode into the yard shortly after sunrise, he found them waiting outside the barn with Tucker sitting between them. Caleb had touched nothing. The leather pouch remained beneath the scattered straw. The attacker's knife lay where Sonny had placed it, and the marks in the dirt outside were still sharp enough to read. Cole dismounted, took one look at the tear across Caleb's coat, and lost the impatience he had carried the day before. Tell me. Caleb did. He kept it plain. No guesses. No accusations. Sonny spoke only when Cole asked what she had seen. The Marshal examined the pouch before lifting it carefully from the straw. Inside were several metal cattle tags and 2 pieces of burned hide bearing partly altered brands. Cole's jaw tightened. Vale's missing stock. Looks that way, Caleb said. Hoofbeats sounded on the road before Cole could answer. Mason Vale appeared through the morning haze with 2 ranch hands behind him. Caleb felt Sonny become still beside him. Mason entered the yard too quickly for a man who supposedly knew nothing had happened. Everett, he called. Heard there was trouble. Cole turned. From who? Mason hesitated for barely a second. One of my boys saw a rider heading this direction before dawn. His gaze found the pouch in Cole's hand, then Caleb. Well, I'll be damned. He dismounted and stepped closer. Those are mine. Caleb watched his face rather than the tags. Mason looked surprised, but not curious. Found them in his barn? Mason asked. Under fresh straw, Cole said. Mason's eyes moved toward Sonny. Then I suppose we know who put them there. Sonny said nothing. She comes onto his ranch the same day my cattle disappear. Mason continued. And now my tags turn up here? Cole frowned. Caleb says a man attacked him last night. Caleb saw his face? Mason asked. No, Caleb said. Then all we know is someone was here. Mason looked at the cut in Caleb's coat. Maybe someone she brought with her. Caleb felt something old and bitter stir inside him. The same rhythm of accusation he had heard around Thomas Reed. A fact became a suggestion. A suggestion became a story. Soon the story became something men remembered as truth. Sonny stood beside the barn door, her bandaged hand resting loosely at her side. She did not defend herself. That silence seemed to irritate Mason more than any argument could have. Say something, he snapped. Her eyes settled on him. Why? Because you're being accused. By you. Mason took a step forward. Caleb moved between them without thinking. Not threatening. Simply present. Sonny noticed. So did Cole. Mason gave Caleb a hard look. You willing to throw away your name for a woman you met yesterday? Caleb looked toward the leather pouch. My name. Doesn't matter if I have to lie to keep it. The yard went quiet. Even Mason's ranch hands avoided his eyes. Cole rubbed a thumb along his jaw. Those tags are evidence, Caleb. I know. And they were found on your property. I know that too. Cole's gaze shifted toward Sonny. Until I understand this. She comes back to Silver Creek with me. Sonny's face did not change, but Caleb saw her shoulders settle into the posture of someone accustomed to having decisions made around her. On what charge? Caleb asked. Cole's patience thinned. I didn't say arrest. Then she can decide whether she goes. You're making yourself look guilty. Caleb almost laughed, though there was nothing amusing in it. That sentence cost me a friend once. Cole stared at him. Caleb had never told him the whole truth about Thomas Reed. 3 years ago, Caleb continued. Everybody knew Thomas stole those cattle. Everybody knew because everybody else said they knew. I listened. 6 weeks later, we found out he hadn't done a damn thing. His voice remained quiet, which made Mason's growing anger seem louder by contrast. I won't do that again. Cole looked away first. Sonny's eyes remained on Caleb. Something had changed in them. Not softness exactly. Something deeper and more careful. Recognition, perhaps. Mason kicked dust from his boot. Fine. Believe her. But those cattle are still missing. No, Sonny said. Everyone turned. She walked toward the northern side of the barn, crouched near the tracks left during the night, and studied them in the strengthening light. They are not missing. Mason's face tightened. What does that mean? It means someone knows where they are. She pointed toward a partial hoofprint near the fence. The rider came from north of here, but when he left, he turned west before reaching the ridge. Cole joined her. You can tell that from this. Sonny rose. From this, no. She pointed farther out, where a thin line of disturbed frost crossed the grass. From that, they followed her nearly a quarter mile. The trail was faint, but once Sonny showed Caleb what to look for, he began seeing pieces of it. Crushed grass, a displaced stone, dark soil exposed beneath. Frost. At the edge of a dry arroyo, she stopped. There were more tracks below. Several horses, wagon wheels, and cattle. Cole climbed down carefully. How old? Yesterday, Sonny said. Maybe last night for the horse. Mason remained above them. Could lead anywhere. Sonny looked up. Yes. Her calm answer seemed to unsettle him more than accusation would have. She moved along the arroyo until she found a place where the wagon wheel had cut deeply into damp earth. Beside it lay a horseshoe print with a squared edge. Caleb saw it immediately. So did Mason. That could be any horse, Mason said. Caleb looked at him. You're right. Mason seemed surprised. Caleb continued. So we follow it until it tells us whose. For the first time, Cole nodded. The wind began rising from the west, warm enough to soften the frost. Sonny looked toward the sky, then down at the trail. We do not have long. By afternoon, the wind will take the lighter signs. Cole glanced toward town. I need witnesses. If we find Vale's cattle somewhere, I want men there who can swear to it. Take your deputies, Caleb said. Meet us back here. Cole mounted and rode toward Silver Creek. Mason hesitated, then swung onto his horse. I'll bring men too. No, Cole called from the road. You'll come with me. Mason's mouth tightened, but he obeyed. When they were gone, Caleb and Sonny stood beside the arroyo in the widening morning light. Her mare was still recovering, so Caleb returned to the ranch and saddled 2 of his own horses. When he came back leading a steady chestnut gelding, Sonny looked at it, then at him. Caleb held out the reins. He's sure-footed. She did not take them immediately. You are giving me your horse. I'm giving you the reins. Her bandaged fingers closed slowly around the leather. Caleb's hand remained there for one quiet second before releasing it. You know the trail better than I do, he said. Lead. Sonny mounted. For a moment she looked down at him, sunlight catching the loose strands of black hair around her face. Yesterday, the whole town had warned Caleb not to trust her. This morning, he had placed the direction of his future in her hands. Sonny turned the chestnut toward the western hills. Caleb mounted beside her. Neither spoke as they rode out together, following a trail the wind was already beginning to erase. The trail climbed gradually into broken country west of the arroyo, where grass gave way to red earth, scattered pinyon, and shelves of sun-warmed stone. Sonny rode ahead at an easy pace, never forcing the chestnut Caleb had given her. Every few hundred yards she slowed, sometimes dismounting to examine something Caleb could barely distinguish from ordinary ground. A bent stem, a scrape along a rock, manure dried only at the surface. The morning wind strengthened steadily, pulling loose dust across their path. We're losing it, Caleb said. Some of it. Sonny crouched beside a narrow wash. Not all. She pointed to the bank where several cattle had climbed out. The soil had collapsed beneath their weight, leaving fresh reddish scars. Caleb studied the marks. 27. Not enough here to count. She stood and looked west. But they were pushed hard. They rode another mile before the trail divided. One set of hoofprints continued toward the foothills while the cattle signs bent southwest through rocky ground. Caleb started toward the cattle trail, but Sonny lifted a hand. Wait. She walked the chestnut toward a mesquite branch and removed a thin strand of dark wool caught on a thorn. Coat? Caleb asked. Maybe blanket. She held it against the sunlight, then tucked it carefully into a fold of cloth. Caleb watched her. You save everything. Only what might speak later. The words stayed with him as they continued. By noon the country opened before them into a shallow basin surrounded by low ridges. Sonny stopped beneath the shade of a cottonwood growing along a nearly dry creek. They watered the horses and shared bread Caleb had packed that morning. For several minutes, neither spoke. The quiet between them had changed since the night before. It no longer felt like distance that needed crossing. Caleb noticed Sonny flexing her bandaged hand. Let me see it. She looked at him. You ask more now. You can still say no. After a moment, she extended her hand. Caleb unwound the cloth carefully. The cut was shallow but swollen around the edges. He rinsed it with water from his canteen, his movements slower than necessary, because he was aware of how easily care could become intrusion. Sonny watched his face rather than her palm. Thomas Reed, she said. Caleb paused. What about him? You trusted the town instead of him. I did. And now you trust me because of that. Caleb tied the clean bandage and released her hand. No, her gaze sharpened. Then why? He looked across the basin, where sunlight shimmered above the rocks. Because you could have left last night. Sonny said nothing. You knew someone was outside. You had a horse, a road south, and no reason to risk yourself for me. There was a reason. Caleb turned toward her. She lowered her eyes to the fresh bandage. You listened when you did not have to. It was a small sentence, spoken almost without emotion, yet Caleb felt its weight. Before he could answer, Sonny rose. She had noticed something beyond his shoulder. On the opposite bank, pressed into a patch of damp sand, was the squared horseshoe mark. Beside it ran the deep groove of a wagon wheel. Sonny followed both with her eyes toward a narrow passage between 2 ridges. They went through there. Caleb stood beside her. Beyond the passage, hidden from the open range, lay country no road crossed and no casual rider would enter. Sonny mounted again. This time, when Caleb handed her the reins she had dropped beside the creek, her fingers rested against his for one brief moment before closing around them. Neither acknowledged it. They rode toward the narrow pass together. Halfway there, Sonny slowed and pointed towards several dark shapes circling far beyond the ridge. Buzzards. Caleb's expression tightened. Dead cattle. Maybe. Sonny looked at the tracks beneath them, then toward the birds. Or something meant to make us stop looking elsewhere. She turned the chestnut away from the obvious path and followed a barely visible line of disturbed stones toward higher ground. Caleb followed without questioning her. By the time they reached the ridge, the wind had erased nearly every track behind them. Ahead, however, hidden deep in the folds of the land, a thin column of smoke rose into the bright afternoon sky. Sonny watched it for a long moment. Then she looked at Caleb. Someone thinks no one knows they are there. Caleb followed her gaze toward the smoke. For the first time since leaving the ranch, Sonny's expression held something stronger than suspicion. It held certainty. They left the horses below the ridge where the rocks would hide them and climbed the last 100 yards on foot. The wind pressed against Caleb's coat, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and cattle. Sonny moved ahead, keeping below the crest until she found a narrow break between two boulders. She lowered herself and looked through it. Caleb came beside her. Below them, concealed inside a long ravine, stood a rough-lined shack, a wagon, and a makeshift corral crowded with cattle. Caleb counted slowly. 27. Some still carried Vale's brand. Others bore fresh, ugly burns where irons had been used to alter the marks. Near the shack, 2 men were feeding a small fire. A third worked beside the wagon. Sonny touched Caleb's sleeve and pointed toward a gray gelding tied in the shade. Even at that distance, Caleb recognized the animal Mason had ridden the day before. His eyes moved to the hind hoof. The squared shoe caught the light when the horse shifted. "That's enough for me," Caleb whispered. Sonny shook her head. "Not for everyone." Caleb knew she was right. Finding Vale's horse beside Vale's stolen cattle would raise questions, but Mason could still claim one of his men had acted alone. They needed Cole. They needed witnesses. Sonny studied the ravine, then the surrounding slopes. "We go back." Caleb glanced at the cattle. "Before they move them? If we confront them now, they deny everything or scatter the herd. We bring Cole here and let him see it untouched." Caleb looked at her, then nodded. No argument. No need to prove courage. They slipped back down the ridge and reached the horses just as distant hoofbeats carried through the pass. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward his revolver. Sonny listened, then relaxed slightly. More than 2 riders. A minute later, Marshal Cole appeared with 2 deputies. Mason rode behind them, his face tight beneath his hat. Sonny stepped into the open. "You found something?" Cole asked. 27 cattle, Caleb said. Mason's eyes flickered. It was small, but Caleb saw it. "Where?" Sonny pointed toward the ridge. "Hidden ravine." Mason gave a sharp laugh. "My cattle? Then we found them. What's the problem?" "Your horse is there too," Caleb said. Silence settled over the group. Mason looked toward the gray gelding he was riding now, then back at Caleb. "I own more than one horse." "The gray you rode yesterday," Sonny said quietly. "Squared hind shoe." Mason's jaw hardened. "You accusing me?" "No," Caleb said. "We're asking you to come look." Cole studied Mason before turning to Sonny. "Lead us." They climbed the ridge together. When Cole saw the ravine, his face changed. One deputy removed his hat and wiped his forehead despite the cool wind. Below, the ranch hand beside the wagon had begun throwing dirt over the fire. Mason swore under his breath. Cole heard him. "Know those men." Mason did not answer immediately. That hesitation was answer enough. They descended without drawing weapons. Cole rode in front and called the men out by name. The youngest ranch hand went pale when he saw Mason. Mr. Vale said nobody would find this place. Mason turned on him. "Shut your mouth." The boy froze. Cole looked from one man to the other. "I think you'd better keep talking." What followed came apart quietly, almost sadly. No gunfire. No heroic charge. Just a frightened young man explaining how the cattle had been driven south, pushed across Apache land, then turned north through Caleb's pasture so the trail would invite the right suspicions. Brands were to be altered here before the herd was sold farther west. The tags in Caleb's barn were supposed to make the story complete. Caleb felt Sonny beside him, silent as stone. "And last night?" Cole asked. The young man lowered his eyes. "Mason sent Wade to Foster's place." Mason's face drained of color. Caleb did not ask what Wade had been ordered to do. The torn shoulder of his coat already knew. Cole stepped toward Mason. You're coming back to Silver Creek. Mason looked at Caleb with something between fury and disbelief. All this because you trusted her. Caleb's eyes moved to Sonny. Wind lifted several loose strands of her black hair across her face. No, he said, because I listened long enough for the truth to catch up. Sonny turned toward him then. Nothing in her expression resembled victory. Only a quiet release, as though she had been holding something heavy for far longer than Caleb understood. And when their eyes met, Caleb realized the truth they had uncovered was no longer the only thing binding their paths together. The ride back toward Silver Creek began under a sky washed clean by the afternoon wind. Marshal Cole sent one deputy ahead with the youngest ranch hand, while the other remained behind to guard the cattle until more men could return for them. Mason Vale rode between Cole and the deputy, his hands free but his revolver already taken. He had stopped protesting. That silence seemed stranger on him than anger. Caleb and Sonny followed several yards behind. The trail descended through the narrow pass, and for a while the only sounds were hooves striking stone, saddle leather creaking, and wind moving through the dry grass below. Caleb watched Sonny more than he meant to. She sat easily on his chestnut gelding, her bandaged hand loose around the reins. Nothing about her suggested triumph. She had been doubted, accused, and nearly blamed for a crime designed to use the town's suspicion of her as evidence. Yet she rode as though proving Mason guilty had never been the point. At the creek, Cole stopped the group to water the horses. Mason remained beneath the deputy's watch while Caleb walked downstream. Sonny was already there, kneeling beside the water and washing dust from her face. Sunlight broke across the shallow current in bright pieces. Caleb crouched several feet away and filled his canteen. You knew where to look, he said. Sonny glanced toward him. I knew where the trail went. That's not the same thing. No, she tightened the cloth around her palm. Knowing where a trail goes does not mean knowing what waits at the end. Caleb considered that. Still got us there. She looked across the creek toward Mason. You got yourself there when you chose not to stop looking. Caleb lowered the canteen. Most people would call what you did last night saving my life. Most people like simple stories. And you don't. Simple stories usually leave someone out. There was no bitterness in her voice, which made the words harder to dismiss. Caleb thought of Thomas Reed again. A simple story had once turned his friend into a thief. Another nearly turned Sonny into one. He looked at the bandage around her hand. You could have been hurt worse. So could you. That's supposed to make me feel better? A small curve touched one corner of her mouth. No, Caleb smiled before he could stop himself. They returned to the horses when Cole called. By late afternoon, the land flattened and the first buildings of Silver Creek appeared beyond the cottonwoods. Word had traveled faster than they had. Men stood outside the mercantile. Two women watched from the boardwalk near the hotel. Conversation faded as the riders entered town. Caleb felt the change immediately. Yesterday, those same eyes had followed Sonny with suspicion. Today, they moved between her, Mason, and Marshal Cole, trying to understand a story that had changed without their permission. Cole dismounted outside his office. Vale stays here until the territorial judge can hear what we have. Mason turned toward Caleb. You think this makes you righteous? Caleb remained beside his horse. No, you chose her word over mine. I chose to look. Mason laughed once, without humor. Same difference. Sonny dismounted nearby and handed Caleb the chestnut's reins. Mason looked at her. Something ugly entered his expression. You think they'll trust you now? Sonny met his stare. I did not come here asking them to. Mason had no answer for that. Cole took him inside. The crowd remained. Caleb could feel their attention pressing against Sonny, waiting perhaps for anger, gratitude, vindication, anything they could understand. She gave them none. She simply checked the chestnut's girth as though preparing to ride back to Foster Ranch. Cole emerged a few minutes later. His hat was in his hands. He stopped before Sonny. I owe you an apology. She looked at him. Cole shifted his. Wait. Yesterday I was ready to take you into town because it made things easier. I told myself it was caution. His eyes dropped briefly. It wasn't all caution. The street had become very quiet. Sonny let the silence remain long enough that Cole had to stand inside his own words. Then she nodded once. Do better next time. Cole looked almost relieved. I intend to. Caleb noticed several people on the boardwalk lower their eyes. No applause followed. He was grateful for that. Some things became smaller when turned into public spectacle. They left Silver Creek before sunset. Sonny rode the chestnut again because her mare remained at Foster Ranch. The miles home passed beneath deepening gold light. Their shadows stretched ahead of them until they nearly touched. At one point, Caleb's gelding stumbled over loose stone. Sonny turned immediately. "You all right?" "I stayed on the horse." "A remarkable achievement." Caleb looked at her. She kept her face straight for 3 seconds before the hint of a smile betrayed her. He laughed softly. It surprised him how unfamiliar the sound felt. Sonny looked ahead again, but the guarded set of her shoulders had eased. They reached Foster Ranch as the sun touched the western hills. Tucker came racing from beneath the porch, circling Caleb before trotting directly to Sonny. She crouched and rubbed the dog behind one ear. "Traitor," Caleb murmured. "He has good judgment. That's what worries me." Inside the barn, Sonny's mare greeted her with a low nicker. The injured hoof looked better. Sonny ran her hand down the mare's leg and tested it carefully. "She can travel tomorrow." The words changed the air between them. Caleb stood beside the stall holding the lantern. He had known she would leave. He had never asked how long she intended to stay because asking might have sounded too much like expectation. "South?" he asked. "Yes." "How far?" Sonny looked at him. "Far enough." He nodded, though the answer left an unexpected emptiness behind his ribs. Together they finished the evening chores. Caleb repaired a loose strap on her saddle, while Sonny brushed the mare. Neither mentioned morning again. Darkness gathered outside. The ranch. House windows began reflecting lantern light across the yard. When Caleb finished the saddle, he ran his thumb over the repaired leather and handed it to her. "Should hold." Sonny examined his work. "You repair things carefully. They last longer that way." Her gaze lifted to his, and the quiet between them deepened. Caleb wanted to tell her that she had saved his life. The words felt insufficient now. She had done more than push him away from a knife. She had forced him to discover whether the promise he had made after Thomas Reed meant anything when keeping it became costly. "Sonny." She waited. Caleb looked down at her bandaged hand, then back into her eyes. "Last night, you do not owe me." "I know." That stopped her. He stepped closer, though still leaving space between them. "That's why I want to say it." Wind moved softly through the open barn door, carrying the smell of sage and cooling earth. "Thank you." Sonny's face softened. Not dramatically, just enough for Caleb to see the woman beneath all the careful distance. "You listened," she said. "Before I saved you. Before you had proof. That shouldn't be rare." "It is." Caleb had no answer. Sonny turned toward her mare and rested one hand against the animal's neck. "You think I saved your life once." Caleb watched her. She looked back over her shoulder. "Maybe you should ask yourself what would have happened to mine if you had handed me to Cole yesterday." The thought settled heavily inside him. Caleb had believed his choice had simply been fairness. Now he understood what it might have cost her if he had chosen differently. Sonny lowered her eyes. "Sometimes," she said softly, "being believed long enough for the truth to arrive is its own kind of rescue." Outside, the final light disappeared beyond the hills. Caleb stood beside her in the warm lantern glow, knowing she would ride away in the morning, and realizing, for the first time, that he did not want the road to take her completely out of his life. Morning arrived clear and cold, laying a thin wash of gold across Foster Ranch. Caleb was in the barn before sunrise, though there was little left to prepare. Sonny's mare stood soundly on all 4 feet. Her saddle had been repaired, her canteen filled, and a small bundle of bread and dried meat waited beside it. Caleb had found reasons to check each thing twice. Sonny entered while he was tightening the final strap. Her dark hair was braided again, and the clean bandage around her palm caught the early light. She looked at the provisions, then at him. "You expect me to get lost? I expect you to get hungry. That is different." "Usually." The corner of her mouth moved slightly. Caleb handed her the saddle without mentioning that he had oiled the leather during the night. Together, they prepared the mare. Their movements fit around each other with an ease that had not existed 2 days earlier. When Sonny reached for a buckle, Caleb already had it. When he stepped around the mare, she shifted without needing to look. Small things. Caleb had learned that small things were often where truth lived. Outside, Tucker waited beside the gate, his tail making slow sweeps through the dust. Sonny knelt and placed her good hand against his neck. The dog leaned into her. "You see," she murmured. "Good judgment." Caleb rested his arms on the fence. "He's easily bribed." With what? Apparently nothing. Sonny smiled then, fully enough that Caleb saw how different her face became when she forgot to guard it. The moment lasted only seconds. She stood and looked south. Open country stretched beneath the morning sky, mile after mile of pale grass and distant red hills. Caleb felt the words he wanted to say gathering somewhere behind his ribs, but none seemed fair. Stay would ask too much. Come back might turn kindness into obligation. So he said neither. Sonny placed one boot in the stirrup, then paused. Caleb, he looked at her. You said I saved your life. You did. She rested her hand on the saddle horn. Once. Caleb waited. Her eyes held his. You saved mine before that. He frowned slightly. I didn't do anything. You listened. The same words she had spoken the night before, but morning gave them a different weight. Cole would have taken me to Silver Creek. Mason would have made sure everyone had his story before I could tell mine. Her gaze dropped briefly. You gave. The truth time. Caleb looked toward the ground. I should have done that for someone else years ago. You could not change what you did then. Sonny's voice softened. But you changed what you did now. For a moment Caleb could hear nothing except wind passing through the cottonwoods. He lifted his eyes. Does that make us even? Sonny considered him. No, no. I do not think everything between people should become a debt. Something inside him loosened at that. She mounted, and Caleb opened the gate. The mare walked through, then stopped. Sonny turned in the saddle. Neither smiled now. There was too much in the silence for that. Goodbye, Caleb Foster. Goodbye, Sonny. She rode south. Caleb remained beside the gate until horse and rider became a small dark shape against the bright land, then disappeared beyond the ridge. Tucker sat beside him, staring at the empty trail. Caleb finally closed the gate. He told himself the ranch was simply quiet again. Yet that evening, when he lit the lamp beside the kitchen window, he left it burning long after supper, facing the southern road. A month passed, and winter edged closer to the New Mexico hills. The case against Mason Vale moved toward the territorial court, his stolen cattle were returned, and Foster Ranch settled again into its old rhythms. Yet Caleb no longer mistook quiet for completeness. One evening, as sunset turned the western sky copper and rose, he finished closing the barn and heard Tucker bark once from the porch. Not an alarm. A greeting. Caleb looked south. A rider stood on the ridge. Even at that distance, he knew her. Sonny descended slowly on her mare, carrying no urgency with her this time. No warning, no trail of stolen cattle. When she reached the yard, Tucker ran to meet her. Caleb remained beside the barn, trying unsuccessfully to hide his smile. Sonny dismounted and lifted a small bundle tied with cord. Herbs, she said, nodding toward the stable. For the horses. Winter makes their joints stiff. Caleb accepted the bundle. That why you rode all this way? Sonny looked toward the house. Warm lantern light shone through the kitchen window. Maybe. Caleb did not ask for another reason. He had learned that some answers needed room to arrive on their own. Sonny glanced at the front door. You still leave it unlocked? Caleb followed her gaze, then looked back at her. Depends who's coming. For a moment neither moved. Then Sonny smiled and walked toward the house. Caleb fell into step beside her. Their shoulders nearly touched, their shadows stretching together across the golden yard. Behind them, the open range darkened beneath the evening sky. Ahead, the lantern burned steadily in the window, and this time Caleb understood why he had kept leaving it there.